Hi, my name is Jennifer. Welcome to Jennifer Loves Books and welcome to my October wrap up. So as I'm filming this, we are about a week into October. I'll tell you about the books I have read so far. First up, in exciting news yesterday, we heard that Liverpool is going to host the Eurovision Song Contest next year, which is very, very exciting. So we've already been looking into how to get tickets, which I imagine is going to be quite difficult to do, but we'll do our best. It's very exciting. In book news, we are full on into spooky season over at Jennifer Loves Books. I am not really a big horror reader normally, but when October comes around, I just want to read all the horror books. And I've read some interesting books so far this month. So first up is The Pallbearers Club by Paul Tremblay. So how do I describe this? So this book is presented as a memoir by a character called Art, and we know right from the start that Art is not his real name. Art at the start of the book is a teenager and he forms the Pallbearers Club. So the Pallbearers Club is a club with him and a couple of other people who attend the funerals of those who don't have anyone to mourn for them. So they go along to mourn for the deceased, even though they didn't know the person themselves. One of the other members of the Pallbearers Club is called Mercy. Again, we know that's not her real name. And Mercy is friends with Art. And what we get at the end of each chapter is a few pages of handwritten notes by Mercy. Because Mercy has found Art's memoir and is reading it, and then throughout is putting her point of view across. And what she also does is where throughout the memoir she makes annotations in the margin, she'll cross things out. One thing that she consistently does is whenever Art refers to his writing as a memoir, she crosses it out and writes novel. And she is saying basically that he is not being entirely truthful about what's happened. She'll say that conversation didn't happen, or you've represented that wrong, or whatever. Art has some suspicions about Mercy and what is really going on with her, which comes through, which she is disputing in her notes throughout the book. I will say this is very slow paced, and for me it was a bit too slow paced, which is why I didn't entirely get on with it. It still, kept my interest enough to read to the end, and I liked the way it went. I thought it was doing some interesting things. Although overall I can't say that I enjoyed it all that much, but that's probably more of sort of a personal preference thing. I don't think this is a bad book by any means. Then I read Under the Skin by Michel, Faber. So this was a reread for me, and I absolutely loved it. It's 5 stars. I adored it. So I read this the first time a few years ago, and it was one of the books that I mentioned recently in my video of sort of spooky season book recommendations. And it's so good. It's kind of difficult to talk about without spoilers, but what I can say is our main character is called Isserley, and Isserley is driving through Scotland, and she picks up hitchhikers, and this is what she does every day. It's a routine thing. Normally she'll pick up, say, 1 hitchhiker a day. The hitchhikers are all men, typically sort of in good physical health. And as we go through the book, we find out more about why she's doing this, what's going on. When she does pick up a hitchhiker, we also get a couple of paragraphs of that hitchhiker's perspective. So what he's thinking as he's in the car with Isserley, his impressions of her, which makes it quite an interesting read. It's difficult to talk about without spoilers. I really like the way it goes. It's not scary. I mean, none of these books that I've read so far have been really scary, but they're all, in some way dark. I know that Becky from Teacup the Storyteller read this recently and really did not like it. And when I've looked at reviews on Storygraph, there are people who really love it, but there are quite a few 1-star reviews from people who hate this book. So I imagine it's probably a bit of a Marmite book, but I I just love it. I think what I love about it is the character of Isserley. I just find her really interesting and quite endearing as well. I like the way the book goes. I really, really like the ending of the book. It was made into a film starring Scarlett Johansson, which I have not seen, but I've heard is absolutely terrible and quite different to the book. So, yeah, I have no desire to watch that. But this, oh, it's just so good. Then I read Carmila by J. Sheridan Le Fanu. This was a random pick from the library because I happened to see it on the classics shelf, which is at the front of the library. And I thought now would be a good time to read it. I am planning on reading Dracula later in the month. And Carmila, famously, is a vampire story which predates Dracula. It's very short. It's only about 100 pages long. So this book is set in Austria. And we have Laura and her father who live together in this castle. Laura's an adult woman living with her father. And one day this carriage crashes outside their castle. And the passengers of the carriage are Carmila and Carmila's mother. Carmila is sort of concussed and disoriented, and as a result of this crash. So Carmila's mother asks Laura and her father to take her in and look after her for a period of time, I think like a few months, while Carmila's mother has to go on some trip, and she'll come back and collect Carmila in due course. So Carmila goes to stay with Laura and her father in this castle. And then Laura and Carmila sort of form this infatuation with each other, really, which is what the book centres on. The book has quite an interesting sort of narrative framing. The prologue, which is just 1 page long, is from someone who has got copies of these writings. So it's from Laura's perspective. Laura's written about the events that happened when she met Carmila and Carmila came to stay at the castle. And these papers have been found and they've been presented to us. I did enjoy this book. I think because it's so short, it was difficult to become too invested in the characters and too immersed in it. But overall I enjoyed it, and it is also pretty gay, which was fun. And then I've been reading the short story collection, so I'm only not very far into it because it's massive. This is the Mammoth Book of Modern Ghost Stories. I don't know why it's called Modern Ghost Stories because they date back to 1900. But my favourite so far was by M.R. James, and it's called "Oh Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad." What a title. So it's about this man who goes to stay in this house, in this village, and he finds a whistle, and when he uses the whistle, he summons up this being, creature thing. But what I particularly like about it is this being, which I won't say too much about because of spoilers, this being is something really, really mundane. And if I told you what it is, you'd be like, that is completely not scary at all, what are you talking about? But I feel like it's very mundanity makes it creepy, and there's been a few times since reading the book where I've been looking at things and being like, ooh. So yeah, I thought it was pretty creepy. The others so far I've not been overly interested in, but I might just pick and choose. I don't know, we'll see how it goes because there's a lot of story. I think it's like over 40 stories in here, so we'll see how we go. Hello, it's now the 15th of October and I have read a few more books this week. First book I read is J.P. Delaney's new book called My Darling Daughter. I already had to take this back to the library yesterday because someone else had reserved it. So, J.P. Delaney is an author whose books I will always get out the library when he brings a new book out. All of his previous books I've given 4 stars, which means I really, really like them. This one I gave 3 stars. I still liked it, but for me it wasn't as strong as his previous books. So My Darling Daughter is about a married couple, and the wife has 15 years ago gave away a baby for adoption. And then 15 years later, this daughter who she's never like seen in the intervening years, turns up on the doorstep. The daughter's having problems with her adoptive parents, and yeah, we go from there. So it's a psychological thriller, domestic thriller. What I have come to expect from J.P. Delaney's books is very tight plotting and lots of twists and turns. And I felt like My Darling Daughter, it kept me engaged. It was quite a page turner, but it just didn't have the extra edge that I feel J.P. Delaney's previous books had. Then I read The Fog by James Herbert. So this is classic horror, first published in 1975. And I will say that there is some stuff in here which is questionable, to say the least, when seen through a modern lens. But despite that, I did thoroughly enjoy it. I thought this was a really great read, and I liked it a lot more than I was expecting to. So, the premise of The Fog is that one day in this town in southern England, this massive crack opens up in the ground, and into this crack disappears houses and shops and people, and then from this crack emanates this yellow fog which sort of drifts across the country and basically turns people mad. So we know from the start that's sort of what's happening, but it takes people a bit to click on to what's going on, because the fog, it's sort of quite contained in the way it moves around, and it doesn't affect people straight away. There's a bit of a delay, and also it can affect people in slightly different ways, although generally speaking people become rather violent and murderous after having been exposed to this fog. It is quite gruesome in parts. It's quite an OTT gruesome, and there is a sort of a central narrative that runs through it. So the main character is called John Holman, and he, when this crack appears in the ground, he's driving along in his car, and his car like almost falls down into the crack, but it gets like stuck at the edge, so he's able to escape, but he has had some exposure to this fog, and he becomes sort of embroiled in the efforts of the police and the government in trying to identify what this fog is, where it's come from. They're trying to find a cure for people who have been exposed to it, and they're also trying to control the fog's movement across the country because it's heading towards London. And then we also get odd chapters where we just look at that chapter at a different random character, and it'll be someone who has in some way been exposed to the fog. So we see a little bit about them and how they've been exposed to the fog, and then the effect that it has on them. There are some very memorable scenes in this. One in particular in a school, which was rather disturbing. But overall I thought it was very engaging, kind of fun in a gory way, and I very much enjoyed it. Next, I do have a DNF, and it's The Road Through the Wall by Shirley Jackson. So the reason I DNF this one was because there was way too many characters for me to keep track of. I have read Shirley Jackson before, and generally I really like her writing style, but in this one it's set in a street called Pepper Street, and right at the start you're introduced to all the different characters, all the different people who live on this street. And so the prologue is about 10 pages long. It's the longest prologue I think I've ever read, and the prologue goes through all these different characters, and then we get into chapter 1, and again we've got like so many different characters, and they all sort of started to merge into one. I couldn't keep track of who was who, and a lot of the names start with the same letter, so I just had to give up on it. Next, unusually for me, I read some middle grade. This is October by Katya, Balen. So the main character in this book is a girl called October. She's 11 years old, and she lives with her father in the woods, and they live a sort of a self-sufficient lifestyle. And then one day her father has an accident and he's in hospital for a period of time. So October goes to stay with her mother who lives in the city. October has not really had much of a relationship with her mother through October's own choosing, but she ends up in this situation where she's having to sort of develop a relationship with her mother and get used to living in a city, get used to having to go to school and all that sort of thing. There's quite a lot of descriptions of nature in here as well. I do think this is a good book. I didn't quite get on with it. Obviously, I'm not the target audience for this book. But also there was sort of a certain distance in the way the story was told, which I didn't quite get on with. But I do think that younger readers would probably really, really like this. And actually, I think a lot of adult readers would like it as well, because I do think it is a good book. Next, I do have another DNF, and this is Daphne by Josh Malerman. So Josh Malerman is probably most famous for the novel Bird Box, which was also made into a movie. I've read, I think, 3 Josh Malerman books before, and I've DNF'd one previously. This is his latest book. I DNF'd it quite early on. It's about a high school student. She's on the basketball team, and one night one of her friends is tells the group this story about this person called Daphne who has died and sort of haunts the town. And what happens is whenever you think of Daphne, she appears and probably does horrible things to you. I didn't get that far in to know actually what happens. There's something about the writing style I didn't get on with. I think Josh Malerman can have a bit of an odd style, and when I've looked at reviews on Storygraph afterwards for this book, there's people who said like they nearly DNF'd it in the first quarter but carried on and then enjoyed it, but I just wasn't interested enough to keep reading. Then this afternoon I've just finished reading Heartstopper Volume 2, which is obviously a graphic novel. I read the first volume a couple of months ago and immediately ordered the second from the library, and this was delightful. This one focuses largely on Nick coming to, understanding more about his sexuality and him sort of starting to come out to other people as well. My only issue with these is that you get through them far too quickly, don't you? I've already ordered book 3 from the library. Hello, it's a few days later and I have read a few more books. First, we have another DNF, which is The Companion by Leslie Thompson. I read about 10 pages of this book. It says it's like the best of Barbara Vine and Agatha Christie, which sounds like it should be my kind of thing. But the reason I DNF'd this was because I just didn't like the writing style. It had that sort of writing style where it just over-explains who people are. So yeah, I mean, I didn't give it much of a chance, but that's fine. Then we have a 5-star read. Actually, we've got 2 5-star reads and a 4-star read. So 5 stars, We Spread by Iain Reid. I love this book so much. So this is Iain Reid's 3rd novel. I've only read one of his previous novels, which was I'm Thinking of Ending Things, which I loved. So, We Spread. The main character is called Penny, and right at the start of the book, she ends up moving into like a retirement home, care home sort of thing, because she's having problems living at home by herself. This is something which has been arranged for her. And this care home is a bit strange. So there's only 4 residents, including Penny, and there are 2 staff who also live there as well. Iain Reid has a sort of a very distinct writing style. He's quite sort of sparse in his writing. There isn't lots of like descriptions and things, but somehow he manages to evoke this atmosphere, and he did the same thing in I'm Thinking of Ending Things. This sort of atmosphere of just sort of like quiet unease as you read in, and you feel like something's not right but you can't quite put your finger on it. So this sort of looks at, I guess, growing old, the ageing process, what's real and what isn't. It's described on the blurb as genre bending, genre defying, which is interesting. I'm not sure if I quite describe it like that, but I do think as you're reading it, you're conscious that depending on what is really going on, it could land in a number of different genres. So it almost could be sci-fi, it could be realist, it could be thriller, it could be horror. But I just loved it. I thought it was brilliant. It is difficult to talk about because there isn't a lot of plot, but there's a lot of atmosphere. And I thought it was brilliant. Then another 5-star read. This was a reread, The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. So I read this for the first time a few years ago and absolutely loved it and wanted to revisit it. So you probably know what this is about. Dorian Gray, a young man, and his portrait is painted, and he sort of makes a wish that he wishes he didn't have to get old, and then his wish comes true because he doesn't get old, but his picture does. And he lives a life of excess. He is sort of well known for this around town. He at one point is engaged to be married and treats this woman quite sort of cruelly, and this cruelness and sort of his sins and things end up displaying themselves on his face in the portrait rather than on himself. The writing in this book is exquisite. There are so many lines as well which you recognise because it's so much is often quoted. One of my favourite lines actually, it's said by Lord Henry Wotton, one of the main characters, and it says, here we are. So, to get back to my youth, I would do anything in the world except take exercise, get up early, or be respectable. I very much like that line a lot. Yeah, this was great. I had kind of forgotten how it ended actually, which I'm not going to say what that is, but the ending is great. And this means I participated in Victober, doesn't it? So then we have is this YA or middle grade? It says teenage reading. I'm not entirely sure what age range, but anyway, it's The Hideaway by Pam Smy. So Pam Smy is the author of Thornhill, which is one of the books I recommended in my recent spooky recommendations video. So this is about a 13-year-old boy called Billy. And Billy lives with his mother and his mother's partner, who is abusive towards his mother. At the start of the book, Billy runs away from home and he goes and sort of stays in this little like bunker thing in the graveyard, which is this thing that no one knows is there apart from Billy. So he hides out there. And then we have sort of two narrative strands. We have Billy's perspective as he's hiding out in the graveyard. He meets this old man who is there tending to the graves. And those sections are illustrated. So, for example, these are illustrated by Pam Smy as well. That's another one. And then the other narrative strand is from the point of view of Billy's mother, who obviously is trying to find him, and the police as well, who are trying to find him. Like Thornhill, it is a good read for this time of year. It is set sort of around Halloween time. There is some spooky goings on in the graveyard. I will say I didn't find it as spooky as Thornhill, but it was still pretty spooky and it was excellent. There's a lot of, there are some quite sort of hard-hitting themes in here. So around domestic abuse and also sexual violence as well, sexual assault. but I thought it was really well written. The illustrations were lovely. This whole edition is just like gorgeous, and I would definitely recommend it. Okay, so I have a few more books to show you. First up, I read a short story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. So this is about Ichabod Crane, who is a teacher, and he goes to live in the village of Sleepy Hollow. There is a legend of Sleepy Hollow of a headless horseman who rides around on the search for a new head. I thought this was fine. I prefer the Disney cartoon of the same name, and for the first time in about 30 years after I read this, I actually listened to the song from that film about the Headless Horseman, which is a brilliant song, and if you don't know it, you should go listen to it. So yeah, so I was pleased to be reminded of that, but I feel like the story was kind of a little bit forgettable. Then I read Whisper by Chang, translated by Roddy, Flagg. So this is a horror novel set in Taiwan. The main character is a taxi driver called Sheng, and Sheng is not really a very nice person. He doesn't treat his wife very well at all. His wife starts to hear this voice, and it's a woman or a girl's voice who seems to be warning her that someone called Minako is going to kill her and her daughter. Events lead up to the wife, this is right near the start of the book, the wife ending up in hospital. And while she is in hospital, she is sort of like kind of out of it, but she is sort of incoherently saying these odd phrases about sort of these voices that she's heard. And then at the same time, her husband, Sheng, discovers a cassette tape in a abandoned taxi. And when he plays the cassette tape, he hears this woman's voice, and it doesn't make any sense, but some of the things that this woman is saying are very similar to these sort of ramblings that his wife is saying in hospital. And so he then goes on a quest to try to figure out what is going on. So the book sort of has the propulsion of a thriller. There are quite strong mystery elements, but there are some really, really great sort of horror images in here. We also get the perspective of a couple of other characters. So there's a social worker who works in the hospital. We get her perspective, and she also sort of becomes embroiled in trying to figure out sort of what's going on. And there's another character who I think is the Sheng's sister-in-law as well. The horror images in this are brilliant. Like, they would be so good on film. Really sort of creepy, really distinct and memorable. And what the book does as well, which is really interesting, is it touches on sort of Taiwanese folklore, and also the sort of struggles of Indigenous people in Taiwan. So there's sort of quite a lot going on in this book, which make it, I think, a really, really interesting read. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I thought it was really, really great, and a book that I will, I'm sure, revisit in future. Then I read The Island of Dr Moreau by H.G. Wells. This is a very, very short book. This is my first time reading H.G. Wells. So this is about a man called Edward who is shipwrecked. He ends up on this island, the Island of Dr Moreau, and Dr Moreau has all these animals, but these animals are all slightly odd, and so Edward's trying to figure out sort of what's really going on. If this book had been any longer, I probably would have DNF'd it. As it is, I read it in an afternoon, and I'm not sure what didn't work for me, but I think there was something about the way the story was told. So we have Edward sort of trying to figure out, but then we all of a sudden get this chapter, which is just Dr Moreau explaining to Edward everything about, you know, what the island is about and the animals and everything that he's doing, which just seems like a slightly dull way to tell a story to me. But I will say, I think it does touch on some sort of interesting things, and I would like to read more by H.G. Wells in future. Then I read Heartstopper Volume 3, which was absolutely delightful. In this one, Nick and Charlie are going on a school trip to Paris. There's a lot about them sort of debating whether to come out as a couple sort of to their friends. It touches on some sort of serious topics as well, like eating disorders and self-harm. And what I really liked as well in this one is sort of some of the side characters and their different plot lines, which I thought was really great, and it's just lovely. And I have book 4 on order from the library. And then I have started to read this short story collection. This is A Sliver of Darkness by C.J. Tudor. So C.J. Tudor does have a new novel coming out in January, but she's just published this short story collection. And I've read 3 of the stories so far, and I am thoroughly enjoying it. It's really, really great. I think I've read all of C.J. Tudor's books so far, and I feel like I may have given them all 4 or 5 stars. This is on track to be a 4-star, I think. I think my favourite so far is the first story in the collection, which is called End of the Liner, and we follow a 70-odd-year-old woman who lives on this cruise liner, and she has not left the cruise liner for 50-odd years, because all of humanity basically now live on cruise liners because the land has become uninhabitable due to some like deadly virus. So yeah, so it's about her living on this cruise ship, and I just thought that was really interesting. Some of the other stories are more sort of like standard sort of horror, with like creepy creatures and things like that. We've just had one which has a bit of a Stephen King flavour about it. But yeah, thoroughly enjoying it. And what's interesting as well is at the start of each story, there's a page of introduction where C.J. Tudor sort of talks about maybe the inspiration for the story or when she wrote it. Some of these stories are from some time ago that she's put into this collection, but they haven't been published before. So yeah, so that's really interesting as well. So yes, I think I'm going to pick up a novel next and then probably go back to some short stories in between. It's now the end of the month and I have a few more books to talk about. First is The Neighbour by Fiona Cummins. I really enjoyed this. This I would describe as a creepy thriller with aspects of police procedural as well, and it's quite a nice blend of all those different elements. So this book is set in this neighbourhood where a serial killer is at large, and when the book opens up we've already had I think about 4 murders, and the bodies have all been found in this piece of woodland at the end of this street. And the book doesn't really focus that much on the victims. Actually, it's about the people living on this street in the neighbourhood who are all in some way suspicious. It's quite clear most of them have some kind of secret, but whether it is the fact that they are a serial killer or whether it's something else is what you're trying to figure out as you read in the book. We also have the perspective of one of the police officers who is involved in the investigation, and then what is quite interesting is we do get some short chapters throughout from the killer themselves. So they're only maybe a couple of pages long each. They are told in the first person, and yeah, they're pretty creepy from the point of view of this serial killer. This was kind of dark in places, but it was just a lot of fun, very creepy, very fast paced, very enjoyable. Then I do have a couple of DNFs. First is The Deathless Girls by Kieran Millwood Hargrave. This is a YA novel, and it's about the origin story of the Brides of Dracula. I didn't get very far into it. It just wasn't working for me. I think it's just not my kind of book. I'm sure it's a very good book, but it just wasn't my kind of thing. And then my next DNF was Death of a Ghost by Marjorie Allingham. This is Golden Age crime fiction, and it's quite an interesting premise. So this painter has died as an old man, and he has left to his wife 12 paintings that have never been seen before, and he asked his wife to unveil one painting each year after his death. So we have 12 years of one painting a year being revealed to the public. And at one of these unveilings, someone is murdered. I didn't actually get to the point of the murder before I just kind of got bored. I think Marjorie Allingham's writing style is maybe just not quite for me. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but for some reason I just find it a bit of a slog to get through. I have read one of her books before, which was The Tiger in the Smoke, which is her most famous novel, and I didn't really get on with that either, so I'm thinking she's maybe, sadly, just not for me. Then I read... not spooky at all, Amsterdam by Iain McEwan. So this was an interesting read. The reason I picked this up was because I heard Nikki from Red Dot Reads and Alice from Alice and the Giant Bookshelf had read this maybe a month or two ago, and from the way they spoke about it, I just thought I was intrigued and wanted to see what it was all about. I have read Iain McEwan before. I've read several of his books, and he is someone who I tend to get on okay with. But I don't think I have loved any of his books that I have read. Amsterdam won the Booker Prize in 1998, and the book opens at the funeral of a woman called Molly. She leaves behind her husband George, and at the funeral there are two men who have both previously been in relationships with her. Their names are Clive and Vernon. So the book is really told from both Clive and Vernon's perspectives. Clive is a composer of music, and Vernon is quite high up in working in a newspaper. He's like a journalist. He's an editor. So we get both of their points of view. It's kind of difficult to talk about the plot without giving too much away because it is a very short novel. Both men separately have some sort of moral or ethical decision to make, and we see how the impact of that plays out for them, and also in relation to the other man. I quite like this book to start with, but by the end I wasn't too keen. I feel like it's quite clunky. So there's a lot of foreshadowing that goes on, and in a kind of obvious way, which I presume is intentional, because the title of the book is Amsterdam, and so whenever Holland is mentioned, you know, it's like the flashing lights going off, because you're like, okay, this is surely going to be significant because Amsterdam is the title of the book. And we see how that builds up towards the conclusion. And after I finished reading this book, I looked it up online, and there was an article from The Guardian from about 10 years ago, I think. And the title was something along the lines of how Iain McEwan's worst book won the Booker Prize, and it listed all the reasons why this is not a very good book. And apparently it's sort of quite well known for not being one of Iain McEwan's best books, even though it won the Booker Prize. I do find it slightly odd that it won. I mean, it's kind of looking at some interesting sort of ethical questions, but again, for me, not in a particularly nuanced way. And yeah, it's a strange one. And the final book I finished is this short story collection, A Sliver of Darkness by C.J. Tudor. So this is a collection of horror short stories, and I thoroughly enjoyed this. I thought this was excellent. I know I've spoken about a couple of these stories already. One of my favourite ones that I've just read is called Dust, and we follow this woman who has gone on holiday by herself. I think she's gone to Gran Canaria. She's just been through a breakup, and as she is on holiday, these strange things sort of start happening. She sees these two children who sort of act a bit odd and say quite strange things. The waiter will sort of appear and disappear, and yeah, as we go through we find out what's going on. But I thought it was excellent, very creepy, very enjoyable. It reminded me of a certain Black Mirror episode. I'm not going to say which one because that would be a spoiler, but I thought it was great. All round, an excellent horror collection. So it's Halloween weekend as I'm filming this, and my next reading plan is I am going to start reading Dracula, so I'm going to start reading that this evening. So my spooky reading is going to continue probably fair on into November. I still have a load of books that I spoke about in my spooky season TBR that I haven't yet got to. They are all up here behind me. So yeah, spooky season will continue, starting, as I say, with Dracula. So we'll see how I get on with this. Thanks so much for watching, and please do let me know what you've been reading. Have you been reading any spooky books? Do you have any recommendations for me? Please let me know. I hope you're all well, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Bye.